Most people think silence means surrender. At Metropolitan General Hospital, that assumption was about to cost them everything. For 90 days, Chief Resident Dr. Chase Harrington treated Reese Kincaid like she was invisible. He mocked her plain appearance. He forced her to scrub toilets while he played God in the trauma bays. He called her a washout and nobody a waste of space. He didn't know that the woman mopping his floors was Chief Petty Officer Reese Kincaid, one of only 12 Tier 1 combat medics in the entire United States Navy. He didn't know that the hands he laughed at had stitched gunshot wounds in 14 countries while mortars exploded overhead. He didn't know that she was on mandatory psychiatric leave after watching a young man she'd trained bleed out in the Mogadishu sand. The hospital staff thought she was nothing. They were about to learn what happens when you mistake a warrior's silence for weakness. The fluorescent lights in Metropolitan General's emergency department flickered with a frequency designed by sadists. It was 7 in the morning shift change, and the smell of burnt coffee mixed with antiseptic created an odor that somehow smelled like exhaustion itself. "Move it, Kincaid. You're blocking the hallway." Reese didn't flinch at the bark. She simply sidestepped, pulling her supply cart flush against the wall with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd learned to make herself small. She was 34, though the fine lines around her eyes and the permanent shadows beneath them made her look closer to 40. She wore scrubs 2 sizes too large, a washed-out shade of teal that did nothing for her complexion. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a severe bun that offered no style-only function. Dr. Chase Harrington breezed past without a glance. He was 38, but carried himself like he owned the building, which in a way he did. As chief resident, his word was law in the ER. He was flanked by 2 exhausted interns and Vanessa Cross, the senior charge nurse who wore her authority like brass knuckles. As I was saying, Harrington continued, his voice pitched for maximum audience impact. The key to a successful trauma response is confidence. You hesitate, the patient dies. You commit, you save a life. It's what separates real physicians from— He paused, casting a theatrical glance back at Reese. Support staff. Vanessa's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Don't worry, Dr. Harrington. I don't think Kincaid could find a vein if we painted it blue. We had to remind her how to log vitals 3 times yesterday." It was a lie. Reese had logged the vitals perfectly on paper because the digital system had crashed, and she'd used the backup protocol that actually saved the data when the system rebooted. But she didn't correct the record. She never did. She just looked down at her shoes, ugly orthopedic sneakers that squeaked on the linoleum, and continued organizing the saline flushes on her cart. Reese was what they called a traveler, an agency nurse brought in to plug staffing holes. In the brutal hierarchy of hospital politics, she ranked somewhere below the janitorial staff. She was transient, disposable, and to Harrington and his entourage, painfully boring. She didn't gossip at the nurses' station. She didn't join the after-work drinks at Hannigan's pub. She arrived 15 minutes early, left 15 minutes late, and spoke only when directly addressed. "She gives me the creeps," Vanessa stage whispered as they rounded the corner toward Trauma Bay 1. "She stands so still, like a statue or something." Harrington checked his reflection in a glass supply cabinet, adjusting his white coat. "She's a burnout, probably washed out of some nursing home in Nebraska. Just keep her away from my critical patients. I don't need her fumbling an IV line when I'm trying to work." Back at the cart, Reese's hands paused. Her knuckles went white around a package of gauze. For exactly 2 seconds, the dull, submissive mask slipped. Her eyes, usually downcast, snapped toward the trauma bay doors with a predatory focus that would have frozen Harrington's blood if he'd seen it. She scanned the room with tactical precision: 2 exits, 3 potential sightlines, 4 objects within reach that could be weaponized if necessary. Then the mask slid back into place. She wasn't checking exits because she was afraid. She was checking them because 15 years of training had made it as automatic as breathing. Reese Kincaid wasn't her real name. Well, it was the name on her nursing license and her tax returns and her apartment lease. But it wasn't the name that appeared on the classified personnel roster buried deep in the Pentagon's Special Operations database. To a very select group of people currently scattered across 3 continents, she was Reaper. Call sign, reputation, legend. To the world, she was a mid-level RN with an unremarkable resume and a personality to match. To Naval Special Warfare Command, she was one of the most lethal combat medics alive. She was here to rest, to decompress, to learn, as the Navy psychiatrist had put it with infuriating gentleness, how to be human again. Normal was proving harder than war. Kincaid, Vanessa's shrill voice cut through the ambient noise like a dental drill. "Bed 4 needs a bedpan change. Mrs. Peterson in 6 spilled her juice all over the floor. Clean it up, now." Reese took a breath, holding it for a count of 4, releasing it for a count of 4. Tactical breathing, box breathing. The technique Navy SEALs use to control their heart rate before pulling a trigger. She used it to keep from throwing Vanessa through a plate glass window. Copy that, Reese said softly. Vanessa's face twisted with irritation. Copy that. What are you in a police movie? Just say yes, you're so weird. Reese walked toward bed 4, gripping the mop handle hard enough that the wood creaked under her fingers. She was trained to incapacitate a grown man in under 6 seconds using nothing but her bare hands. Her current mission was mopping up apple juice. Adapt and overcome, she whispered to herself. Just survive the shift. The chaos started at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Tuesdays were supposed to be quiet. Mondays brought the weekend's accumulated stupidity. Fridays brought the start of fresh stupidity, but Tuesdays were the dead zone. Except the universe had a sense of humor, and Metropolitan General was the punchline. The radio crackled to life with the particular frequency of panic that made every head in the ER snap up. Metro General, this is Unit 2-3. We have an MCI inbound. Repeat mass casualty incident. Charter bus versus tanker truck on the I-5 interchange. We are 8 minutes out. 15 red tags, 8 yellow. Prepare for heavy trauma. Multiple criticals. The atmosphere shifted like barometric pressure before a storm. Boredom evaporated, replaced by the electric crackle of adrenaline. Dr. Harrington clapped his hands together, and Reese saw something light up in his eyes. This was his stage. This was where he proved he was more than a white coat in a god complex. All right, people, look alive. His voice carried the particular confidence of someone who'd never actually failed at anything important. I want Trauma 1 and 2 prepped for surgical airways. Vanessa, get blood bank on the line. Tell them we need ONEG standing by. Interns, stay out of my way unless I specifically tell you to breathe. His eyes landed on Reese, who was already restocking the crash carts with a speed and efficiency that went completely unnoticed in the controlled chaos. Kincaid, Harrington barked. You're on triage. Stay in the waiting room. Keep the walking wounded out of my hair. I don't want you anywhere near the critical cases. Are we clear? Understood. Reese said, her voice flat as Kansas. Good. And don't try to play hero. Leave the medicine to the medical professionals. 10 minutes later, the ambulance bay doors exploded open. It was a scene from a war zone minus the mortar fire. Stretchers rolled in like an assembly line of human suffering. Paramedics shouted vitals over the symphony of moaning and crying. Blood soaked through white sheets, turning them pink, then red, then something darker. Reese did exactly what she was told. She moved through the minor injuries in the waiting room, applying pressure dressings, checking pupillary responses, soothing terrified college students who just learned that life was fragile and buses were made of metal that crumpled like aluminum foil. She worked with robotic precision. Her hands moved faster than most people could track, securing bandages with knots that were textbook perfect. Actually, they were better than textbook. They were military grade, taught at Fort Bragg to men and women who needed to stop arterial bleeding while people shot at them. But nobody noticed. In the chaos, competence looked like luck. Then the screaming started in Trauma Bay 1. I can't get the tube, his airway's collapsing. Reese froze. She was in the waiting room holding a gauze pad to a cheerleader's forehead laceration. But she could hear everything, and she recognized the wet gurgling sound of a tension pneumothorax turning into full respiratory arrest. BP's dropping 60 over 40. That was Vanessa, her voice climbing into hysteria. He's coding, doctor. I know he's coding, Harrington screamed back, and there was something in his voice that Reese hadn't heard before. Fear. Raw, unfiltered panic. Give me the glide scope, no the bougie. Damn it, I can't see the cords. There's too much blood. The patient was the bus driver. 57 years old, crushed chest, deviated trachea. If they didn't relieve the pressure in his chest and secure an airway in the next 60 seconds, he was dead. Reese knew this with the same certainty she knew her own name. She looked at the waiting room. Everyone was stable. Minor injuries handled. She set down the gauze, turned, and walked toward the trauma bay. She didn't run. Running caused panic. She moved with a fast, gliding walk that covered ground silently like a predator closing distance on prey. She pushed through the double doors. The scene was a disaster. Harrington was sweating through his scrubs, jamming a laryngoscope into the bloody mouth of a dying man. His hands were shaking so badly he looked like he was trying to perform surgery during an earthquake. Vanessa was fumbling with an IV bag, her hands trembling so violently she couldn't spike it. The monitors screamed their single-note song of death. He's hypoxic, saturation is 45%, an intern shouted. Shut up, I'm trying to think. Harrington roared, throwing a suction catheter on the floor. Reese stepped up to the bedside. She didn't ask permission. She didn't announce herself. She simply moved into the space between the intern and the supply cart like water finding the path of least resistance. She assessed the situation in under 2 seconds. Massive facial trauma. Harrington was trying to intubate orally, but the anatomy was destroyed. This was a can't intubate, can't ventilate scenario. The patient needed a surgical cricothyrotomy, a hole in the neck, immediately. Scalpel, Harrington demanded, his voice cracking. I need to cut, but his hand was shaking. The scalpel hovered over the patient's neck like a trembling leaf, and Harrington's eyes were wide with the terrible realization that he was about to cut into a human throat, and he wasn't sure he could do it without killing the man. Do it, doctor, Vanessa cried. Please! He couldn't. The pressure, the noise, the blood, it had broken something in him. He froze. The patient's oxygen saturation dropped to 42%. Then 40. The monitor's alarm changed pitch, heading toward flatline. Reese didn't hesitate. Move! It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered in a tone that dropped the room's temperature by 10 degrees. The voice of someone who'd given orders in places where hesitation meant death. Harrington blinked, stunned by the sheer force of authority in that single word. What? Reese didn't repeat herself. She hip-checked him. Not gently. She slammed her hip into his with enough force to knock him off balance and away from the patient's head. Before he could protest, she snatched the scalpel from his loose grip. Kincaid, what the hell are you? Reese's left hand found the landmarks on the patient's neck with the precision of someone who'd done this in the dark in sandstorms while buildings exploded. Thyroid cartilage. Cricoid cartilage. The cricothyroid membrane between them, about half an inch of tissue separating life from death. She made a single vertical incision 1.5 centimeters. No hesitation. No tremor. Clean. She flipped the scalpel in her hand, using the handle to blunt dissect the tissue, widening the hole. Blood welled up, but her hands were steady as stone. 6.0 ET tube, now! Her voice was gravel. Command voice. The voice that had once ordered a team of Navy SEALs to hold position under fire. Vanessa stood paralyzed, mouth open. Now! The word was guttural, primal, the sound of a woman who'd screamed over the roar of helicopter rotors and incoming mortar fire. Vanessa jumped like she'd been shocked instinctively, thrusting the endotracheal tube into Reese's waiting hand. Reese guided the tube into the opening she'd created. She felt the subtle pop as it entered the trachea. She inflated the cuff with her left hand, while her right attached the ambu bag. She squeezed. The chest rose. The monitor, which had been wailing the song of imminent death, changed its tune. The oxygen saturation numbers began their climb. 50%, 68%, 75, 85. The room fell into a silence so complete that the only sound was the rhythmic whoosh of the ambu bag as Reese squeezed it, forcing oxygen into lungs that had been starving. She looked at the rise and fall of the chest's verified breath sounds on both sides with a stethoscope she pulled from her pocket. A pocket that nurses weren't supposed to carry stethoscopes in, and then secured the tube with tape in a pattern that was distinctly military in its precision. She didn't look at Harrington. She didn't look at the interns who were staring at her with their mouths hanging open like landed fish. She stripped off her blood-soaked gloves, dropped them in the biohazard bin, and turned to Harrington, who was leaning against the wall with his face the color of old newspaper. Patient is secure, doctor, Reese said, her voice returning to its quiet, submissive monotone. You can proceed with the chest tube now. She turned and walked out of the trauma bay, back toward the waiting room, to finish bandaging the cheerleader's head. Inside the bay, the silence stretched and stretched until it felt like it might break the windows. Did she? An intern stammered. Did the quiet nurse just do a 3-second crick? Harrington straightened his coat. His face flushed from white to red, the humiliation burning hotter than the fear had. He'd frozen, in front of his team, in front of interns who would tell the story. And the woman he'd called a burnout, the woman he'd relegated to mopping floors, had just saved a life he'd been about to lose. She got lucky, Harrington hissed, grabbing a fresh pair of gloves with shaking hands. Reckless. Endangered the patient. If she ever touches my instruments again, I'll have her license pulled so fast she'll... He stopped, realizing he was ranting. He looked at Vanessa, who was still staring at the door Reese had walked through. Write her up, Harrington said quietly. Insubordination, practicing medicine without a license, assault on a physician. I want her gone. Vanessa nodded slowly, but her eyes didn't leave the door. She was still shaking, but now it wasn't from the stress of the trauma. It was from the look she'd seen in Reese Kincaid's eyes for that brief moment when she'd taken control of the situation. It wasn't the look of a nurse. It was the look of something dangerous. The silence in the administrative conference room was heavier than the lead aprons they used in radiology. It was suffocating sterile, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of Dr. Harrington's pen against the mahogany table. Click, clack, click, clack. Reese sat in a low vinyl chair that seemed specifically designed to make the occupant feel small, powerless. Across the table sat Harrington, Vanessa, and Mr. Holloway, the hospital's risk management administrator. Holloway looked less like someone who worked in healthcare and more like an undertaker who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong building. Holloway adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and slid a thick manila folder across the table. The paper made a dry, scratching sound that set Reese's teeth on edge. Miss Kincaid, Holloway began, his voice carefully neutral. We've reviewed the incident report filed by Dr. Harrington and Nurse Cross regarding yesterday's events in Trauma Bay 1. The allegations are severe. Reese sat perfectly still. To an untrained observer, she looked submissive, maybe even paralyzed with fear. To someone who knew what to look for, she was in a rest position, conserving energy, observing the threat, waiting. Dr. Harrington alleges that you physically assaulted a superior physician. Holloway continued reading from the paper in a monotone that suggested he'd read 1,000 reports just like this one. That you forcibly removed him from a patient's bedside during a critical procedure. That you performed an invasive surgical airway, a cricothyrotomy without a physician's order outside your scope of practice and without proper sterilization protocols. Holloway looked up over his glasses and Reese saw the calculation in his eyes. He was already working out the liability, the potential lawsuit, the insurance premiums. This is grounds for immediate termination, Miss Kincaid, and potentially criminal charges. Assault and battery. Practicing medicine without a license. You could go to prison. Reese didn't blink. She looked at Harrington. The doctor was leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He'd regained his composure since the trauma bay. The fear that had paralyzed him was gone, replaced by vindictive arrogance. He wasn't grateful the patient was alive. He was furious that a travel nurse had witnessed his moment of cowardice. It was chaos, Harrington said smoothly, turning to Holloway with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned to lie with confidence. I had the situation under control. I was preparing to perform the cricothyrotomy myself when he gestured vaguely at Reese. She panicked, shoved me aside, grabbed the scalpel. It was pure luck she didn't sever the patient's carotid artery. A miracle, really. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a tone of wounded professionalism. We can't have loose cannons playing surgeon in my ER, Holloway. She endangered a patient's life. What if she'd cut wrong? What if she'd nicked the thyroid? We'd be looking at a wrongful death suit right now instead of just this. Vanessa nodded vigorously, her red hair bouncing with each emphatic movement. She was manic, Mr. Holloway. I've never seen anything like it. It was terrifying. She just took over, like she was possessed or something. The lies hung in the air, thick and oily. Reese's mind replayed the actual events like a video on loop. Harrington's shaking hands, the patient's oxygen saturation at 45%, the gray pallor of death creeping across the bus driver's face. If she hadn't intervened, that man would be in the morgue right now, and Harrington would be explaining away a preventable death as a tragic complication. She could destroy him. Right here, right now. She knew exactly how to do it. She could demand a review of the security camera footage. She could recite the exact timeline of events down to the second. She could articulate the medical decision tree with the precision of someone who'd performed cricothyrotomies in conditions that would make this sterile conference room look like a vacation. She could speak with the authority of a Tier 1 operator and dismantle his lies piece by piece until there was nothing left but his cowardice exposed for everyone to see. But she couldn't. To defend herself was to reveal herself. A mediocre travel nurse with a community college degree doesn't know more about emergency airway management than a chief resident. A quiet woman who mops floors doesn't possess the tactical vocabulary and command presence to counter-interrogate a risk manager. A nobody doesn't have the absolute certainty in her own competence to go to war with a hospital's entire administrative structure. If she fought this, they would look closer. They would pull her background. They would find the gaps in her employment history, the redacted sections, the phone numbers that led to voicemails at the Pentagon. They would find the truth, and the truth would end her medical leave. The psychiatrist's voice echoed in her head, gentle but firm. No conflict, Reese. No stress. Just exist. Learn to be human again. That's the mission now. So she swallowed the truth. It tasted like ash and copper and failure. I apologize, Reese said softly. The words felt foreign in her mouth, wrong, like speaking a language she'd never learned. Harrington's eyebrows shot up. He'd expected a fight. He'd wanted her to scream, to argue, to give him an excuse to call security and have her dragged out. Her submission disappointed him more than her intervention had angered him. I panicked, Reese continued, forcing the words out one by one. I saw the patient dying and I just reacted. I know I overstepped. I'm sorry, Dr. Harrington. The room went quiet. Harrington looked at Holloway, sensing victory but somehow feeling unsatisfied, like he'd won a game but forgotten why he was playing. Well, Holloway exhaled, tapping the folder with one manicured finger. An admission of guilt does simplify things. I want her gone, Harrington said flatly. Fired, license revoked. She's a liability. Holloway shook his head slowly. We can't fire her immediately without a union inquiry, and the agency contract is ironclad for another 4 weeks. If we terminate for cause, we have to file a police report. Do you want a police investigation into your trauma bay, doctor? Do you want reporters asking questions about why a travel nurse had to save your patient? Harrington stiffened, the color draining from his face. The last thing he wanted was scrutiny. Fine, Harrington spat, but she comes nowhere near my trauma bays. She doesn't touch a needle. She doesn't touch a chart. She doesn't even look at a patient without my express permission. Holloway turned to Reese, and she saw something in his eyes that might have been pity or might have been contempt. With administrators, it was hard to tell. Miss Kincaid, consider this a formal reprimand. You are on probation. Effective immediately, you are demoted to level 1 support duties, bedpans, linen changes, stocking supplies, janitorial assistance. If you so much as hand a doctor a tongue depressor without permission, you will be escorted out of this building by police. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Reese whispered. Get out of my sight, Harrington muttered, already pulling out his phone, dismissing her from his reality. Reese stood. She didn't look at them. She turned with slow, deliberate control and walked out of the glass-walled conference room. As the heavy door clicked shut behind her, she leaned against the cool wall of the corridor. Her heart rate was 52 beats per minute, resting. Controlled. Her face was calm as still water, but her hands, hidden deep in the pockets of her scrubs, were clenched into fists so tight that her fingernails cut crescents into her palms. It wasn't the humiliation that bothered her. She'd been screamed at by drill instructors who made Harrington look like a kindergarten teacher. It wasn't the demotion. She'd cleaned latrines in boot camp. It was the injustice of it. The realization that in this civilized world of policies and procedures, the truth didn't matter. Only the hierarchy mattered. Only who had the power to craft the narrative. She pushed off the wall. She had toilets to scrub. 3 days passed in a blur of degradation. Reese became a ghost in the machine of Metropolitan General. True to their word, they stripped her of every nursing responsibility. She was no longer a healer. She was a servant. She spent her 12-hour shifts changing soiled sheets for geriatric patients who didn't remember their own names. She mopped the floors of the waiting room while teenagers stepped over her without looking down, absorbed in their phones. She restocked the trauma bay's Trauma Bay 1, specifically while Harrington and his interns laughed and joked 5 feet away, treating her like she was furniture. Hey, Kincaid, Harrington would call out, dropping a candy wrapper on the floor she just cleaned. Missed a spot. Reese would stop. Look at the wrapper. Pick it up. She never spoke back. She never sighed. She just did the work. But the silence was becoming dangerous. It was the night shift, 3 in the morning. The hospital existed in that strange, suspended state between the chaos of evening and the rush of morning. The lights were dimmed in the hallways. The air hummed with the white noise of ventilation systems and the distant beeping of cardiac monitors. Reese was in room 304, changing a trash bag. She wasn't supposed to do patient care, but the night shift orderly had called in sick and someone had to empty the bins. The patient in 304 was a new admission. Colonel Garrett Sullivan, 72 years old, retired Army Rangers. End-stage COPD, broken hip, from a fall in his apartment. He'd been in the hospital for 2 days, and Reese had been avoiding this room specifically because she recognized the look in his eyes. He was awake now, struggling to breathe against the nasal cannula hissing oxygen into his nose. And he was watching her. You move quiet, a raspy voice said. Reese froze. She turned slowly to look at the old man. His skin was papery thin, mapped with age spots and scars, but his eyes were sharp, blue, watery with age, but alert in a way that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Sorry to disturb you, Colonel Sullivan, Reese said softly. Just clearing up. Didn't say you disturbed me, Sullivan wheezed, adjusting himself painfully in the bed. Said you move quiet, like you're on patrol, checking corners, looking at exits. That's tradecraft, Reese offered a polite practice smile, the one she used to deflect curiosity. Just trying to let you rest, sir. Sullivan watched her for a long moment. He looked at her hands, rough scrubbed raw from industrial cleaner, but strong, capable. Then he looked at her posture. Even while bent over a trash can, her spine was straight. Her head never stopped moving, in small, almost imperceptible sweeps. Scanning, always scanning. You weren't always a janitor, Sullivan said. It wasn't a question. Reese stiffened slightly. I'm a nurse, sir. Just on light duty. Bullshit. The word came out on a rattling exhale that turned into a cough. Sullivan tapped his chest, waiting for the spasm to pass. Army Ranger, he continued when he could breathe again. Grenada 83, Desert Storm 91, 1st Battalion. I know how soldiers move, kid. You check corners like you're expecting contact. You look at people's hands before you look at their faces. You position yourself between me and the door without thinking about it. He leaned forward as much as his broken hip would allow, squinting at her in the dim light. Navy Marines. You're too careful to be Army. Reese's eyes flickered to him, and for just a moment she let him see something real. The connection was instantaneous. It was a frequency only people who'd served could hear. The shared language of violence and sacrifice. Navy, she whispered, almost without meaning to. Medical leave. Sullivan smiled, revealing teeth yellowed by age and too many cigarettes. I knew it. Corpsman. Something like that, Reese said, her voice dropping to a murmur. She shouldn't be having this conversation. It was a breach of her cover, a crack in the wall she'd built. But God, she was so tired of pretending to be invisible. So tired of being alone. Sullivan nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd said. You got the look, kid, the 1,000-yard stare. I see it when you think nobody's watching. You're carrying something heavy. Reese abandoned the trash bag. She walked to the foot of his bed, her guard lowering just an inch. Just enough to breathe. Just trying to put it down, Colonel. Hard to put it down when people like that doctor in the hallway keep kicking it around, Sullivan growled. His voice carried the edge of someone who didn't suffer fools, even at 72, with broken bones and failing lungs. I heard him talking to that red-headed nurse, calling you the mute. Said you were useless, worthless. Reese looked down at her hands. They were steady now, but she could still see the ghost of blood on them. Always blood. It doesn't matter what he thinks, sir. It matters if you let it, Sullivan said. He pointed a shaking finger at the television mounted on the wall. It was muted, playing the 24-hour news cycle on a loop. World's on fire, kid. Men like that doctor, they play games, politics, egos. But when the real fire comes, they burn just like everyone else. People like you. He paused, his eyes intense. You walk through fire. You carry people out of it. Reese looked up at the screen. The news banner at the bottom was read urgent. She took a step closer and unmuted the television. Reports are coming in of a massive coordinated attack on the U.S. consulate in Mogadishu, Somalia. Communications are down, but sources indicate a paramilitary group has breached the compound. Several high-value diplomatic personnel are unaccounted for, and the White House has convened an emergency session. The footage was grainy, shaky cell phone video, black smoke rising in pillars against a harsh blue sky, the distinct crack, crack, crack of AK-47 fire. Distant shouting in a language most Americans didn't speak. Reese's blood turned to ice in her veins. She knew that compound. She trained there 2 years ago. She knew the layout, the security protocols, the blind spots in the perimeter fence. And she knew with sick certainty who was probably stationed there right now. That's not good, Sullivan whispered, watching the screen. Reese didn't hear him. The hospital room was dissolving around her. The smell of antiseptic was being replaced by the smell of burning diesel fuel and cordite. The beep of the heart monitor became the squelch of a tactical radio frequency, and superimposed over the news footage, she saw a different scene. A younger face. Kyle Brennan, 24 years old, grinning at her from under his helmet. The kid she'd trained, the kid she'd Kincaid. The shout shattered the memory like glass. Reese spun around her body, moving into a defensive stance before her brain caught up. Doctor. Harrington was standing in the doorway holding a clipboard, looking annoyed in the specific way that people who'd never experienced real problems looked annoyed. What are you doing watching TV? Harrington scoffed, stepping into the room. I told you to empty the trash in the East Wing. Do you need a map? Is this hospital too complicated for your skill set? Reese stared at him. For a moment, she didn't see a doctor. She saw an obstacle, a target. Her pupils dilated. Her breathing slowed and deepened. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a small voice that sounded like her SEAL instructor whispered, "Throat strike, 2 seconds. Need a solar plexus. He's down. Threat neutralized." Harrington frowned, noticing something different in her expression. It wasn't the submissive look he'd grown accustomed to. It was something else. Something that made his hindbrain scream danger even if his conscious mind couldn't articulate why. "Are you deaf?" Harrington snapped, stepping closer to reassert his dominance. "I said get out of here." Reese looked back at the television. The news anchor was speaking urgently, words scrolling across the bottom of the screen. "Breaking news, extraction team requesting emergency medical support. Consulate medic confirmed KIA." She looked back at Harrington. The contrast was nauseating. This man worried about trash bags and clean floors while halfway around the world people were dying. "People she'd trained, people she'd—" "I'm going," Reese said. Her voice was different, flatter. The gray mouse was cracking. "And turn that off," Harrington ordered, gesturing to the television. "It's upsetting the patient." "Leave it on," Sullivan barked from the bed. "I want to watch it." Harrington rolled his eyes. "Mr. Sullivan, you need rest. High stress levels are contraindicated for your oxygen saturation. We need to—" He snatched the remote from the bedside table and clicked the television off with a flourish. "Hey!" Sullivan protested. Harrington turned his back on the patient to glare at Reese. "If I catch you slacking off again, I'll have you escorted out of this building tonight. I don't care about the staffing shortage. I don't care about your contract. You are a parasite, Kincaid. You contribute nothing. You just take up space." Reese gripped the handle of the trash cart. The metal felt cold under her palms. She could feel her control slipping. 3 seconds, the voice whispered. 3 seconds and he's unconscious. 3 seconds and you never have to hear his voice again. She closed her eyes, forced herself to breathe, to remember where she was, who she was supposed to be. "Understood, doctor," she said. She pushed the cart past him, and as she did, her shoulder brushed his arm. It was barely contact, a whisper of fabric against fabric. But Harrington flinched, not from pain, from something else. A sensation of radiating tension, of coiled violence, barely contained, like standing too close to a caged animal. Reese walked down the hallway. The squeaky wheel of the trash cart echoed in the fluorescent silence. But her mind was no longer in Metropolitan General Hospital. She was calculating flight times to Somalia. She was mentally inventorying her gear bag, which sat collecting dust in the trunk of her beat-up Honda Civic parked in the employee lot. She was running through medical scenarios, wondering how bad it was, wondering who was hurt, wondering if she shoved the cart into the utility closet and leaned her forehead against the cold metal shelving, breathing hard. "Please," she whispered to the darkness, "don't call me back. I'm not ready. I can't." In the pocket of her scrubs, her personal phone vibrated. Not the cheap smartphone she used for civilian life. The other one. The black, ruggedized device she was never supposed to have on the hospital floor. The one that didn't exist on any civilian network. It vibrated once, long, twice, short. That was the pattern, the specific pattern that meant one thing and one thing only. Priority Alpha. Answer now. Reese pulled the phone out with shaking hands. It was heavy, blocky, encased in black rubber. No screen, just a biometric thumb scanner and a single button that glowed red in the darkness of the utility closet. The LED was blinking. Green, green, red, green, green, red. Priority 1 activation. Her thumb hovered over the scanner. Her heart rate climbed from resting to operational. 52 beats per minute to 70, to 85. Not panic, preparation. The gray mouse was dying. The operator was waking up. She pressed her thumb to the scanner. The device chirped once, a soft electronic confirmation that it had read her biometric signature and verified her identity against a database that existed in a server farm buried under 300 feet of Virginia granite. "Reaper online," she whispered into the darkness. The voice that came through the encrypted connection was distorted metallic, but she recognized the cadence. Commander Rachel Vance, her handler, her lifeline. "Reaper, this is Warhammer. Authentication code Delta Zulu 9. "Authenticated," Reese replied automatically. Her voice had changed, dropped an octave, lost all trace of submission. "What's the situation?" "We have a critical incident in Mogadishu. U.S. consulate breached. Ambassador is secure but critical. Multiple GSWs to chest and abdomen. Extraction team is pinned down in a hardened safe room. They've been holding position for 18 hours. Reese's eyes closed. She could see it in her mind. The compound, the walls. The safe room in the basement with reinforced doors and enough supplies to hold for 72 hours if necessary. "What do you need, ma'am?" "Their medic is KIA. 3 words. They hit like bullets. Reese's breath caught. Who? Petty Officer First Class Kyle Brennan, sniper round to the neck, bled out before they could get pressure on it. Kyle, the kid who'd asked her 1,000 questions during training. The kid who'd been so nervous before his first deployment that he'd thrown up in the latrine and begged her not to tell anyone. The kid who'd sent her a photo 2 months ago of him in full kit, grinning like an idiot with the caption, "I got this, Chief. You taught me good." Dead. Reese Vance's voice cut through the static and the grief. "Are you there?" "I'm here," Reese said. Her voice was hollow. "The team is requesting you. By name. They need a Tier 1 combat medic to stabilize the ambassador for extraction. The nearest asset is 14 hours out. The ambassador has maybe 45 minutes. Maybe. "I'm on medical leave," Reese said, but the words sounded weak even to her own ears. "I'm not cleared. The psych eval." "The Secretary of Defense just cleared you personally," Vance interrupted. "This is coming from the top. We need you, Reese. The team needs you. Will you answer the call?" Silence. The utility closet smelled like industrial lemon cleaner and mop water. Outside, she could hear the hospital humming along oblivious. Harrington was probably at the nurse's station right now, making some joke at her expense. Vanessa was probably laughing. Reese looked at her hands. They were steady now. No tremor, no hesitation. She thought about Kyle Brennan, 24 years old, dead on a concrete floor in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. She thought about the ambassador, some diplomat whose name she didn't know, bleeding out while the clock ticked down. She thought about the team, her team, pinned down, outgunned, afraid. "What's the ETA on extraction?" she asked. "Helo lands at your position in 6 minutes. Gear is on board. Full kit." 6 minutes. Reese looked down at her scrubs, at her ugly orthopedic shoes, at the mop bucket that had become her entire world for the last 90 days. "I'm in," she said. "We knew you would be," Vance replied, and there was something like relief in the distorted voice. "See you wheels up, Chief." The line went dead. Reese stood in the darkness for exactly 3 seconds. Then she moved. But before Reese could leave the utility closet, before she could strip off her scrubs and become Reaper again, the hospital's overhead PA system crackled to life. "Code Blue Trauma Bay 2, Code Blue Trauma Bay 2. All available personnel respond immediately." Reese froze. Her hand was already on the door handle, already preparing to kick over the mop bucket and walk out of this place forever. But something in the urgency of that announcement made her pause. Code Blue meant cardiac arrest. Someone was dying. "It's not your problem anymore," a voice in her head said. "You're done here. The Black Hawk is 6 minutes out. Leave." But her feet wouldn't move. Through the thin walls of the utility closet, she could hear running footsteps, shouting, the particular controlled chaos of a medical emergency. And underneath it all, a sound that made her blood run cold. A child screaming. Reese yanked the door open and looked down the corridor. Nurses were sprinting toward Trauma Bay 2. She saw Harrington running, his white coat flapping behind him. She saw Vanessa with the crash cart fumbling with the paddles. And she saw through the open Trauma Bay doors a small figure on the gurney. Maybe 8 years old, maybe 9. A girl with blonde hair and pigtails, her face turning blue, her tiny chest heaving with the effort to breathe. Anaphylactic shock. Reese knew the signs immediately. Bee sting probably, or peanuts, something that had triggered a massive allergic reaction. The child's airway was swelling shut. Without immediate intervention, she would suffocate in front of her screaming mother. "Walk away," the voice said. "This isn't your fight. Kyle is dead. The ambassador is dying. The team needs you." But Reese's feet were already moving. She dropped the trash cart and walked toward Trauma Bay 2. Not running. Running would draw attention. She moved with that same fast gliding walk, covering ground silently. She reached the doorway and looked in. Harrington was at the head of the bed, trying to intubate, but his hands were shaking not as badly as during the bus crash, but enough. The girl was thrashing, hypoxic, terrified. Her oxygen saturation was dropping 78%, 74-70. "I can't get the tube," Harrington shouted. "She's moving too much. Someone sedate her." "We can't sedate her if we can't get IV access," an intern yelled back, jabbing a needle at the girl's arm and missing as she jerked away. Vanessa was frozen with the epinephrine auto-injector in her hand, staring at the chaotic scene. Should I? EPI, give her EPI, Harrington screamed. "Now!" But Vanessa was panicking, looking at the child's thrashing legs, unable to find a clear moment to administer the shot. The girl's lips were turning from blue to gray. Her oxygen saturation hit 68%. Her eyes were rolling back. Reese looked at her watch. The Black Hawk would be here in 4 minutes. 4 minutes and she could leave all of this behind. Leave the humiliation, the degradation, the petty tyranny of Dr. Chase Harrington. She looked at the little girl dying on the gurney. She saw Kyle Brennan's face. 24 years old, bleeding out while she'd been 30 feet away making a different choice. Triage, the mission over the teammate. Not again. Reese stepped into the trauma bay. "Move," she said. Harrington's head snapped up. For a moment, his face showed pure rage at the interruption. Then he saw who it was, and the rage turned to something uglier. Contempt. "Get out," he snarled. "You're not allowed in here, security." Reese ignored him. She walked straight to Vanessa, who was still holding the EpiPen with trembling hands. "Give me that," Reese said quietly. "Don't you dare," Harrington shouted. "Vanessa, if you hand her that medication, I'll have both of you fired." Vanessa looked between them, paralyzed by indecision. The girl's monitor alarm changed pitch. Oxygen saturation, 62%. Reese didn't wait for permission. She simply reached out and took the EpiPen from Vanessa's loose grip. "Security!" Harrington bellowed. "Someone get security in here now!" Reese moved to the side of the gurney. The little girl was barely conscious now, her struggles weakening as hypoxia took hold. Reese placed one hand firmly on the child's leg, holding it still with controlled pressure, found the lateral thigh muscle, the vastus lateralis, the safest site for intramuscular injection. Position the EpiPen. "Don't you fucking dare," Harrington hissed, abandoning the intubation attempt to lunge toward her. Reese pressed the auto-injector against the girl's thigh and triggered it. Click! The spring-loaded needle punched through the skin and delivered 0.15 milligrams of epinephrine directly into the muscle. She held it there for the required 10 seconds, counting silently, while Harrington grabbed her shoulder and tried to pull her away. "You just assaulted a child," he screamed in her ear. "You just administered medication without an order. You're done, Reese released the EpiPen and stepped back, letting Harrington's momentum carry him stumbling backward. And they all watched. The girl gasped, a horrible, wet, rattling gasp, but it was air, getting in. Her oxygen saturation number flickered. 64%, 68, 72. The blue tinge began to fade from her lips, her eyes focused. She started crying a beautiful, healthy, oxygen-rich cry. "Mom!" the girl wailed. The mother, who'd been restrained by two nurses in the corner, broke free and ran to the gurney, sobbing, cradling her daughter's face. The trauma bay went silent, except for the sound of the mother's relieved weeping and the child's cries. Harrington stood frozen, his hands still outstretched from where he'd tried to stop Reese. His face was white, then red, then purple with rage. "You," he started, his voice shaking. "You just, without authorization, you..." Reese turned and walked toward the door. "Don't you walk away from me!" Harrington's voice pitched into a shriek. "Security! Stop her! She assaulted a patient!" Reese kept walking. Out of the trauma bay, down the corridor. Her hands were shaking now. Not from fear, from rage. From 90 days of suppressed fury finally boiling to the surface. She heard footsteps behind her. Harrington running to catch up. "You're insane," he yelled. "You could have killed that child, you could have..." Reese stopped walking. She turned around slowly. Harrington stumbled to a halt, suddenly aware that they were alone in the corridor. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The floor was still wet from where she'd mopped earlier. "That child was at 62% saturation," Reese said quietly. "She had maybe 30 seconds before cardiac arrest. You were trying to intubate a thrashing patient. You would have lacerated her airway and caused a pneumothorax. The intern couldn't get IV access. Nurse Cross was frozen. The child was going to die." "You don't know that," Harrington said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Yes," Reese said, taking a step toward him. "I do." Another step. "Because I've done pediatric resuscitations in field hospitals where the power was out and we were rationing oxygen. I've treated anaphylaxis while mortars were landing 50 meters away. I've intubated children younger than that girl in the back of moving vehicles, with no light except a headlamp." Another step. Harrington was backing up now, his bravado crumbling. "You want to know what I am, doctor?" Reese's voice was steel. "I'm someone who's been trained by the best combat medics in the world. I've performed more emergency procedures in 10 years than you'll do in your entire career. And that little girl is alive right now because I did my job." "You're just a nurse," Harrington whispered, but it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. No, Reese said. I'm not. And then from outside, they heard it. The sound that had been building while they talked. The deep, rhythmic thumping that made the windows rattle and the floor vibrate. Harrington's eyes went wide. What is that? Reese checked her watch. Right on time. She turned and walked away from him toward the utility closet where her transformation awaited. Behind her, Harrington stood in the hallway listening to the approaching thunder, his world beginning to crack. The utility closet was dark and smelled like industrial lemon cleaner and damp mop heads. But to Reese, it no longer smelled like shame. It smelled like a chrysalis, a place where one version of herself would die so another could emerge. She stripped off the oversized scrub top, revealing the black tactical compression shirt she always wore underneath. She couldn't break the habit, couldn't stand feeling exposed. Even pretending to be a civilian, she'd kept this one piece of armor. She kicked off the scrub pants. Underneath, she wore dark, cargo-style pants that could pass for nursing wear, but were actually designed for durability and movement. She reached up and pulled the pins from her hair. The severe bun unraveled dark brown hair falling around her shoulders. She shook it out, feeling the weight of it shift. She needed it loose. The helmet she'd be wearing in 5 minutes required it. She looked at the mop bucket, at the symbol of 90 days of degradation. Then she kicked it over. Water and industrial cleaner flooded across the utility closet floor, soaking her ugly orthopedic shoes. She watched it spread, a small act of rebellion that felt monumentally satisfying. She turned and kicked the door open. It slammed against the wall with a bang that echoed down the corridor, leaving a dent in the plaster. A passing orderly jumped, dropping a food tray. Jesus, Kincaid, you okay? Reese didn't answer. Didn't even look at him. She walked into the corridor with her head up for the first time in 90 days. Her stride was different, longer, purposeful. The walk of someone who'd covered ground while carrying 100 pounds of gear in 120-degree heat. She rounded the corner into the main ER station. Dr. Harrington was there, leaning over the counter, talking rapidly to Vanessa. When he saw Reese approaching, he straightened up, pointing at her. There she is. Vanessa, call security. I want her arrested for assault for practicing medicine without a license for... Reese walked past them, not hugging the wall, not sidestepping. Straight down the center of the corridor, and 2 interns scrambled out of her way. Harrington's voice pitched higher. Don't you walk away from me, I'm talking to you. Reese kept walking. She heard him run around the counter, heard his footsteps accelerating, felt his hand grab her arm. The reaction was instant, automatic. 15 years of muscle memory taking over. Reese stopped. She didn't spin. She simply reached up with her left hand, fingers moving with surgical precision, and clamped down on his wrist. She found the pressure point between the radius and ulna bones, the radial nerve, one of the most sensitive nerve clusters in the human body. And she squeezed. Harrington screamed. It was a high, thin sound, nothing like the commanding voice he used when ordering around nurses and interns. His knees buckled. The pain was instant and overwhelming, his entire nervous system lighting up. Reese twisted his wrist, applying steady, controlled force, and Dr. Chase Harrington, chief resident of Metropolitan General Hospital, dropped to his knees in the middle of the corridor. The entire ER went silent. Patients stopped moaning, nurses froze mid-action, an intern stood with a syringe halfway to a vein mouth hanging open. Reese leaned down. Her face was inches from Harrington's. Her eyes were empty, cold, the eyes of someone who'd looked at death so many times it had stopped being frightening and become just another tool. Do not, she whispered, her voice like grinding metal, ever touch me again. You're breaking my arm. Harrington gasped, tears streaming from his eyes. Security! Someone get security! Reese released him with a small shove that sent him sprawling onto his back on the polished linoleum. She stood over him, looking down with the same expression she might use to examine something, scraped off her boot. You're a child playing with toys, Harrington, she said loud enough for the entire floor to hear. You think you save lives. You delay death. You patch holes and pray. Pray you never see the real thing. Pray you never have to make a choice that actually matters. She took a step toward the exit, then paused and looked back at him. That little girl in Trauma Bay 2 is alive because I did what you couldn't. Remember that when you're filing your reports. You're fired, Vanessa shrieked from behind the nurse's station, her face bone white. Get out, you're insane, I'm leaving, Reese said calmly. Not because you said so. She turned toward the automatic sliding doors that led to the ambulance bay. Behind her, she could hear Harrington scrambling to his feet, cradling his wrist. Security is coming, he yelled, his voice cracking. Don't let her leave. She assaulted me. I'll have her arrested. The two security guards, both overweight men in their 50s, waddled toward her with their hands hovering uncertainly near their empty belt loops. "Ma'am," one said nervously, "ma'am, you need to stop right there." Reese ignored them. She pushed through the doors into the cool pre-dawn air, and then they all felt it. It started as a vibration in the soles of their feet, the kind of vibration you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The windows of the ambulance bay began to rattle in their frames. Then the car alarms in the parking lot started going off one by one, triggered by the pressure wave. Thump, 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 thump. The sound grew louder, deeper. A rhythmic beating that resonated in bone marrow. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of the medical transport helicopter they were used to. This was heavier, more primal. It was the sound of war coming home. "What is that?" Vanessa whispered, running to the window. "Earthquake," an intern suggested. Harrington stood in the middle of the corridor, still cradling his wrist, staring at the doors Reese had just walked through. Something cold was spreading through his chest. Fear. Real fear, maybe for the first time in his comfortable life. Outside, Reese stood in the center of the parking lot. The wind from the approaching aircraft whipped her loose hair across her face. She looked up at the pre-dawn sky and watched the stars disappear. From the darkness, a shape emerged. Massive, black, absolutely terrifying. An MH-60M Blackhawk, the special operations variant. Matte black paint that seemed to absorb light. No markings except a small serial number on the tail boom that meant nothing to anyone without Pentagon clearance. It didn't approach cautiously. It came in aggressive, banking hard rotors, churning the air with apocalyptic violence. The downwash hit the parking lot like an artillery strike. Dust, trash, loose gravel, everything became projectile. The Reserve for Chief of Staff sign ripped out of its concrete mooring and cartwheeled across the lot, smashing directly into Dr. Harrington's BMW windshield with a sound like a gunshot. Inside the ER, chaos erupted. "It's crashing," someone screamed. "Get away from the windows." "Call 911, Dr. Harrington, ego momentarily overriding survival instinct, pushed through the doors. "You can't land here. This is private property. You're destroying." He watched in horror as his $60,000 car was systematically stripped of paint by flying debris. "My car." The helicopter flared, nose pitching up, rotors screaming. It hovered 10 feet above the ground landing gear, crushing the hospital's carefully maintained landscaping. This was a combat insertion. Fast, precise, aggressive. The side doors slammed open before the wheels touched down. 4 figures fast roped out, sliding down thick braided lines with practiced ease. They hit the asphalt in tactical crouches, weapons immediately coming up to defensive positions. These weren't police, weren't National Guard, weren't anything the civilian staff had ever encountered. They were giants wrapped in multicam uniforms, heavy plate carriers, ballistic helmets with night vision goggles flipped up. They carried HK-416 rifles with suppressors, weapons that cost more than most people earned in 6 months. They moved with mechanical precision, a choreography learned through hundreds of operations. 2 secured the perimeter, immediately rifles scanning for threats. 2 advanced toward the hospital entrance. Harrington stepped forward, running on pure indignation. "I am Dr. Chase Harrington, Chief Resident. You are violating Federal Aviation Administration regulations. You're destroying hospital property. I demand to know who authorized." The lead operator turned his head. He was built like a linebacker with a beard that spilled over his chin strap. On his shoulder was a patch showing a trident piercing an anchor, the Navy SEAL insignia. He looked at Harrington the way someone might look at a gnat. Then he looked through him. "Clear left," he shouted over the rotor noise. "Clear right," his partner responded. A 5th figure emerged from the helicopter. She didn't fast rope. She waited for the aircraft to settle, then stepped out with the bearing of command. Flight suit, communications headset, commander's insignia. Commander Rachel Vance walked straight toward the ER entrance, the rotor wash, whipping her flight suit. Harrington, his brain still trying to process events, stepped in front of her. "I am Dr. Chase Harrington, Chief Resident of this facility." "You cannot." Vance extended one gloved hand and pushed him aside. Not violently, just moved him out of her path. Harrington stumbled backward into Vanessa. "Where is she?" Vance shouted. Behind them, the automatic doors hissed open. Reese Kincaid walked out. But she wasn't Reese anymore. The gray ghost was gone. This was Reaper. She stood tall, feet planted shoulder-width apart. The wind tore at her hair, but she looked immovable. Her eyes locked onto Commander Vance with laser focus. Vance saw her, and for just a fraction of a second, her combat-hardened face softened. Chief Vance snapped a salute so crisp it could have cut steel. The 4 operators turned in perfect unison. They saw Reese. Immediately, their weapons lowered. Four massive warriors snapped to attention. In perfect synchronization, their voices boomed, "Chief!" The sound echoed off the hospital walls, rolling across the pre-dawn quiet like thunder. Harrington's face went through a spectrum of colors: white, red, gray. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "Chief," Vanessa whispered. The janitor is—" Reese walked forward, past the stunned doctor, past the gaping nurses. She walked straight to Commander Vance. "You're late, ma'am," Reese said. "Traffic was hell," Vance replied. "Package is on board. Full kit waiting. We're wheels up in 30 seconds. Reese nodded once. Then she turned to look at the hospital one last time. She saw the faces in the windows, the nurses who'd ignored her, the orderlies who'd stepped over her, the interns who'd laughed at Harrington's jokes. And standing directly in front of her, Dr. Chase Harrington and Vanessa Cross. Harrington was shaking. His brain couldn't reconcile the data. The woman he'd called a washout. The woman he'd relegated to cleaning toilets. The woman he'd mocked, being saluted by a Navy SEAL commander. "You," Harrington stammered, pointing a trembling finger. "Who are you?" Reese looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time, she let him see what lived behind her eyes. "I'm Chief Petty Officer Reese Kincaid, United States Navy SEAL Teams. Tier 1 combat medic. The hands you mocked have stitched gunshot wounds in 14 countries while mortars exploded overhead. The skills you called community college. They're taught at Fort Bragg and Naval Amphibious Base Coronado." She paused, letting that sink in. "You played doctor in climate-controlled rooms, Harrington. I do it in 120-degree heat while people shoot at me. You're nothing." She turned to Vance. "Let's go, ma'am." "Mount up," Vance ordered. Reese ran toward the helicopter. As she reached the open door, one of the operators extended his hand. She grabbed it, and he hauled her aboard. But before she disappeared into the aircraft, a voice called out from the hospital entrance. "Reese!" She turned. Colonel Garrett Sullivan sat in a wheelchair at the automatic doors, pushed by a shocked orderly. Somehow, impossibly, he was wearing his old Army dress uniform. The jacket hung loose on his wasted frame, but the ribbons were still there. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. He'd planned this, knew she was leaving, had prepared. Sullivan raised his shaking hand in a salute. It wasn't crisp anymore. His arm trembled with the effort, but it was perfect in its intention. Reese's throat tightened. She crossed the distance between the helicopter and the wheelchair in 5 strides, dropped to one knee, and took his hand in both of hers. She helped him hold the salute steady. "Hoo-ya, Chief," Sullivan rasped. "Go save some lives. That's the mission." "I'll come back, Colonel." "I know you will, kid." His eyes were wet. "But first, you go do what you were born to do. Make 'em proud. Make 'em all proud." Reese stood step back and rendered a salute that would have made a drill instructor weep. She held it for 3 full seconds. Then she turned and ran back to the helicopter. Inside the dark belly of the aircraft, she grabbed the duffel bag stenciled with her call sign. "Reaper, STM-8. She pulled on the headset and keyed the mic. "Reaper is on board," she said calmly. "Get us airborne." "Roger that, Chief," the pilot responded. "Wheels up." The engine screamed. The Black Hawk lurched skyward, the landing gear leaving the destroyed asphalt, banking hard to the east. On the ground, Harrington and Vanessa stood in the vortex of dust and exhaust, staring up at the machine as it climbed into the lightning sky. They watched until it disappeared completely. Harrington looked down at his white coat, coffee-stained, wrinkled. His wrist was swelling, already turning purple. His BMW's windshield was spiderwebbed with cracks. "She broke my wrist," he whispered. "She actually broke my wrist." Vanessa stared at the empty sky. "I think she broke a lot more than that, Chase." Behind them, still sitting in his wheelchair, Colonel Sullivan watched the helicopter until it was just a speck against the dawn. Then he looked down at his dress uniform, at the ribbons he'd pinned on one last time. He smiled. "Worth the wait, kid," he whispered. "Worth every damn second." Then he closed his eyes, suddenly exhausted. The orderly wheeled him back inside, back to room 304, where Sullivan would sleep for a few hours before waking to watch the news coverage of what happened next. High above the city, 6,000 feet, and climbing, Reese Kincaid stripped off the tactical compression shirt and pulled on combat fatigues from her duffel. She strapped on the plate carrier, feeling the familiar weight settle across her shoulders. She checked her medical kit with practiced efficiency: tourniquets, hemostatic gauze, chest seals, morphine, surgical crick kit, blood volume expanders. Everything was there. She looked out the small window at the city lights below. Metropolitan General was already invisible in the sprawl. Commander Vance's voice crackled in her headset. ETA to Ramstein is 6 hours for refuel, then another 6 to target. Total flight time 12 hours. Ambassador has maybe less than 1 hour from this moment. Math doesn't work. It will, Reese said quietly. Chief, I need you to understand something. Vance's voice was serious. The team has been holding that safe room for 18 hours. No food, limited water. They're exhausted, and they just lost Kyle. Their morale is... I understand, ma'am. Do you? Vance leaned forward. Because when you get there, you're not just going to be their medic. You're going to be their reason to believe they can still win. Kyle was their brother, and now you have to be their hope. Reese pulled a photo from her pocket. Kyle Brennan in full kit, grinning under his helmet. 24 years old. Forever. She tucked it into her plate carrier right over her heart. I was born ready, ma'am, she said. But as she said it, she looked out the window one more time at the disappearing city. Somewhere down there in room 304, an old ranger was sleeping. Somewhere, a little girl with blonde pigtails was breathing easily alive because someone had made a choice. Somewhere, a doctor was staring at his shattered car and shattered ego, finally understanding what real competence looked like. And somewhere, very soon, an ambassador and a SEAL team were about to learn that Reaper had answered the call. The helicopter raced toward the horizon. Reese closed her eyes and felt something she hadn't felt in 90 days. Purpose. She wasn't Reese Kincaid anymore, the invisible nurse who cleaned floors. She was Reaper, and she was going home. The Black Hawk's interior smelled like gun oil sweat and jet fuel. For 6 hours, Reese sat in the jump seat while the helicopter ate up distance, crossing the Atlantic in darkness. The 4 SEAL operators dozed in their seats with that particular skill. Soldiers developed the ability to sleep anywhere, anytime, because you never knew when the next chance would come. But Reese couldn't sleep. She sat with her eyes closed, running through scenarios: liver laceration, hemothorax, hypovolemic shock. 15 minutes to stabilize a patient who'd been bleeding for nearly 20 hours. The math was impossible, but impossible was just another word for Tuesday in her world. At Ramstein Air Base in Germany, they refueled in 20 minutes. The ground crew moved with practiced efficiency, understanding that every second counted. Reese stepped out onto the tarmac, stretching her legs, breathing the cool German air. Commander Vance approached with a ruggedized tablet. Ambassador Richard Grayson, Vance said, pulling up a photo. 62 years old, career diplomat, 2 gunshot wounds to the chest, 1 to the abdomen. The extraction team got him into the safe room, but he's been bleeding for 19 hours now. Reese studied the photo. Distinguished-looking man, gray hair, kind eyes. Probably had grandchildren. Probably coached Little League. What about our people? 2 wounded SEALs. Staff Sergeant Wade Harrison, through and through, to the shoulder. Ambulatory but losing blood. Corporal Blake Thorne, fragmentation wounds to both legs. Tourniquets applied. Stable but in pain. Vance paused. And you know about Kyle? Yeah. Reese's jaw clenched. I know. The team is requesting you by name, Reese. They trust you. After Kyle, Vance's voice softened. They need you to be their anchor. I understand, ma'am. Vance handed her the tablet. Satellite imagery of the compound. Study it during the second leg. You'll have 1 shot at this. Reese took the tablet and climbed back into the Black Hawk. As the rotors spun up again, she studied the tactical map, the compound layout, the safe room location, the likely positions of hostile forces. She was memorizing the battlefield before she ever set foot on it. 6 more hours. Over the Mediterranean, over North Africa, descending toward the chaos of the Horn of Africa. The sun rose somewhere over Egypt, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Reese of blood and fire. The lead operator, Chief Petty Officer Marcus Kane, moved to sit across from her. They'd worked together in Afghanistan 3 years ago. Good to have you back, Reaper, Kane said over the intercom. Wish it was under better circumstances. It always is. Kane checked his rifle. Team's been holding that safe room for 19 hours. No food, limited water, taking pot shots every time they show movement. They're running on fumes and grief. How bad is the ambassador really? Kane's face told her everything. Without you, he's already dead. Even with you, he shrugged. You've got 15 minutes to stabilize him for a 6-hour medevac flight. You've done more with less, but never with stakes this high. What about the hostiles? Approximately 25 to 30 fighters, mostly small arms, at least 2 RPG teams. They know we're coming. They're dug in and waiting. Reese nodded. Insertion plan. Fast rope into the east courtyard. It's the only LZ that's not completely exposed. You sprint 40 meters to the safe room door. We provide suppressing fire. You get inside, do your thing. We extract to secondary LZ 400 meters north. Time on ground, 15 minutes total. Any longer, and we're pinned. Understood. ETA 30 mics, the pilot announced. LZ is hot. We're going in fast and loud. Reese strapped on her helmet, checked the chin strap, pulled on gloves. The Black Hawk began its descent. Through the window, she could see Mogadishu spreading below a circuit board of lights and shadows. Somewhere down there, people were waiting. Bleeding. Dying. Somewhere down there, Kyle Brennan's body was growing cold. She closed her eyes and made herself a promise. Not one more, not today. Everyone comes home. The insertion was textbook perfect and absolutely terrifying. The Black Hawk came in hard and fast, flaring at the last second. The wheels barely touched down before the side doors slammed open. Reese was first out, boots hitting courtyard stone, immediately moving toward the safe room entrance. Incoming fire cracked overhead. Small arms poorly aimed, but enough to be deadly if you were unlucky. Suppress! Kane's voice boomed. The SEAL operators returned fire with controlled bursts. The distinctive sound of HK 416 is sharp and professional. Reese sprinted 40 meters across open ground. Her medical kit bounced against her hip. The plate carrier was heavy but familiar. She'd run this exact scenario 100 times in training, but training didn't have real bullets snapping past your head. An RPG streaked overhead, impacting the wall behind her. The explosion was deafening. Stone fragments peppered her helmet. She didn't slow down. The safe room door opened before she reached it. Hands grabbed her, pulling her inside. The door slammed shut. The gunfire immediately muffled to distant pops. The safe room was dark, lit only by chemical glow sticks, casting everything in sickly green. It smelled like blood, fear, and too many bodies in too small a space. "Chief's here!" someone shouted. Reese saw the relief on their faces. Young faces, exhausted faces. Faces that had been holding this position for 19 hours, watching their brother die, wondering if they'd die too. "Who's senior?" she barked. "That's me, Chief." Petty Officer Thompson stepped forward. His uniform was crusted with dried blood, some as most the ambassadors. "Thank God you're here." "Where's the ambassador?" Thompson pointed to the corner. A figure lay on a makeshift litter, another SEAL kneeling beside him, applying pressure. Reese dropped to her knees and immediately began assessment. Ambassador Grayson looked terrible. Skin pale and clammy, lips tinged blue. Breathing shallow and rapid, 28 respirations per minute. Pulse thready and weak at 140 beats per minute. She lifted his blood-soaked shirt, 2 entry wounds to the chest, 1 to the upper abdomen. No exit wounds. The rounds were still inside him, tearing him apart from within. "Sir, can you hear me?" Reese checked his pupils with a penlight, reactive but sluggish. "Am I—" the ambassador wheezed. "Am I going to die here?" Reese looked him directly in the eyes. "Not today, sir. I didn't fly 6,000 miles to lose you." She keyed her radio. "Warhammer Reaper, I'm in. Starting stabilization, clock starts now." "Roger, Reaper," Vance's voice crackled. "You have 15 minutes, not 1 second more." Reese blocked out everything else. The gunfire outside, the wounded SEALs watching her, the weight of expectations. There was only the patient and the problem. First priority, breathing. She applied vented chest seals over both entry wounds, one-way valves that would let air escape but not enter. She listened with her stethoscope. Left lung sounds diminished. Tension pneumothorax building. 14-gauge needle, she said calmly. Thompson handed it without hesitation. Reese found the landmark. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Inserted the needle with smooth, controlled pressure. There was a hiss as trapped air released. The ambassador's breathing immediately eased. His oxygen saturation began climbing. 68%, 72, 78. Second priority circulation. "Can't get a line, Chief," Thompson said. "We tried. Veins collapsed." "IO drill." She positioned the intraosseous drill on the proximal tibia. The drill whirred to life, boring through bone in 2 seconds. She screwed in the catheter. Direct access to bone marrow established. She hung a bag of Hexton blood volume expander and squeezed hard. 500 milliliters in under a minute. Outside, an explosion. The building shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. "Reaper, heavy contact." Vance's voice was tight. "RPG just hit the north wall. How much longer?" 10 minutes. "You have 5. Reese didn't argue. She moved faster. Third priority, the abdominal wound. This was the killer. Liver laceration, bleeding into the peritoneal cavity. She couldn't operate. Couldn't open him. All she could do was pack and pray. She ripped open packages of quick-clot hemostatic gauze. Packed the wound cavity deep, ignoring the ambassador's scream of pain. Morphine. Thompson handed her an auto-injector. She administered it into the IO line. The ambassador's face relaxed as the narcotic hit. His blood pressure was rising. 80/50. Not great. Survivable. Oxygen saturation holding at 85%. Heart rate dropping from crisis to merely dangerous. He's stable enough, Reese announced. Get him on the litter. We're moving. 4 SEALs lifted the ambassador. Reese stayed at his head, managing the airway, keeping pressure on the abdominal wound. Extract team, this is Reaper. We're coming out. Packages stable for transport. Roger, Kane's voice came back. LZ is 200 meters north. We've got suppressing fire laid down. It's going to be hot. Move fast. The door opened. Mogadishu air rushed in warm and tasting of smoke. The SEALs moved in tactical formation, weapons up, scanning for threats. Reese stayed with the litter, one hand on the ambassador's chest, the other holding the IV bag high. They moved through the compound at a controlled rush. Gunfire cracked around them. Rounds impacted walls, kicking up dust and stone fragments. Reese felt one pass close enough to her head that she heard it snap the air. She didn't flinch, kept moving, kept monitoring the ambassador's breathing, kept the IV flowing. 200 meters felt like 200 miles. Then she heard it, the beautiful, brutal sound of rotors. The Black Hawk came in fast, not attempting a full landing, hovering 3 feet off the ground with crew chiefs extending their hands. The litter went up first. Reese climbed in, right behind, never letting go of the ambassador. Harrison and Thorne were hauled aboard. Then the extraction team. The Black Hawk was pulling pitch before the last man was fully inside, climbing hard and fast while insurgent fire chased them into the sky. A round pinged off the hull, another. Taking fire, the crew chief shouted. But the pilots kept flying, kept climbing, and then they were out, free, racing toward the coast. Reese rechecked the ambassador's vitals, blood pressure holding, oxygen saturation steady at 86%, breathing stable. He was unconscious now, the morphine and blood loss pulling him under, but his body was fighting. He'd make it to Ramstein. She sat back against the vibrating metal wall, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Kane handed her a water bottle. She drank half in one pull. Textbook, Chief, Kane said. Absolutely textbook. Reese looked at the empty space where Kyle Brennan should have been sitting. Doesn't feel like it. Kyle would be proud, Kane said quietly. You saved the package. You got the team out. That's what he'd want. Reese nodded but didn't trust herself to speak. 6 hours later, the Black Hawk touched down at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Medical teams were waiting a full trauma response. They rushed the ambassador to the surgical suite while Reese gave the trauma surgeon a rapid-fire briefing. 2 chest GSWs, 1 abdominal. Tension pneumothorax decompressed with 14-gauge needle. IO access established, 500 mils Hexton administered. Wound packed with quick clot. 5 milligrams morphine via IO line. Last vitals BP 80/50, heart rate 110, SPO 2, 86%. The surgeon was scribbling notes, nodding. Perfect field stabilization, Chief. Truly perfect. You saved his life. He wouldn't have lasted another 20 minutes. Reese nodded, too tired to feel pride. She walked to the transient barracks, stripped off her blood-soaked uniform, and stood in the shower for 20 minutes. Pink water circled the drain. She watched it, thinking about Kyle, about the little girl at Metropolitan General, about all the blood she'd seen in 15 years. When she finally emerged wrapped in a towel, Commander Vance was waiting. Ambassador's out of surgery, Vance said. Stable, critical, but stable. The surgeon says your field work was the difference. Without it, he'd have died on the operating table. Just doing my job, ma'am. Your job was impossible. Vance handed her a tablet. You're on the news. Reese looked at the screen. CNN was showing footage of the Black Hawk landing at Metropolitan General Hospital. Her walking through the parking lot in her black tactical shirt. The operators saluting her. Sullivan's wheelchair salute. The headline, Navy SEAL medic saves ambassador in daring rescue. The janitor they mocked was a Tier 1 warrior. The story was everywhere. Every network, trending #1 on Twitter. The YouTube video had 6 million views in 8 hours. The hospital, Reese asked quietly. Vance pulled up another tab. News van outside Metropolitan General. Reporter interviewing shocked staff. Risk manager Holloway's statement. We are cooperating fully with Department of Defense investigation. Another clip, Harrington's BMW being towed, windshield shattered. Security footage leaked somehow, showing Harrington on his knees, Reese standing over him. Viral. Harrington's done, Vance said. DOD filed formal complaint. State Medical Board opened investigation. Hospital suspended him pending review. He'll be lucky to keep his license. Reese handed back the tablet. What about the little girl, the one with anaphylaxis? She's fine, fully recovered. Her mother is calling you a hero. Vance smiled slightly. Though technically you did administer medication without authorization. She was dying. I know. And that's what the hospital told the mother when she tried to thank the nurse who saved her daughter. They explained you'd been fired for insubordination. Vance's smile widened. Then the mother watched the news. She's now demanding the hospital reinstate you and honor you. It's a PR nightmare for them. Good. Vance's expression turned serious. What now, Reese? You're cleared for active duty. The team wants you back. But I need to know, are you ready? Reese thought about Kyle's photo in her plate carrier, about Sullivan's salute, about 90 days of hiding. No, ma'am, I'm not going back to the teams. Vance's eyebrows rose. Retirement, teaching. I want to train the next generation of combat medics at Coronado, so they're ready when their moment comes. So they don't, her voice caught. So they're ready. Vance nodded slowly. The schoolhouse would be lucky to have you. I'll make the calls. Thank you, ma'am. Reese, Vance's voice softened. Kyle's death wasn't your fault. You were where you were supposed to be. He knew the risks. I know. Reese looked at the floor. But maybe if I train the next generation well enough, fewer of them will die doing the job I taught them. That's all any of us can do. 48 hours later, Reese Kincaid walked through the front doors of Metropolitan General Hospital. She wore her navy dress blues. Ribbons lined her chest. The trident pin gleamed gold on her lapel. Her hair was pulled back in a regulation bun. Her posture was parade ground perfect. The receptionist looked up and gasped. Oh my God, you're her. Whispers spread through the lobby like wildfire. Within seconds, every nurse on shift knew. The janitor was back, but not as janitor. As Reese walked through the ER, staff members didn't just stare. They moved. They stepped aside. A young intern one who'd stepped over her while she mopped pressed himself flat against the wall, eyes wide. An orderly she'd never seen actually saluted, awkward and unpracticed, but sincere. She passed the supply closet where she'd kicked over the mop bucket. The door still showed the dent. Someone had put a handwritten sign out of order, maintenance. She passed Trauma Bay 1, empty now, but she could still see the ghost of that moment. Harrington frozen, the bus driver dying, her hands moving with absolute certainty. She passed Trauma Bay 2, where the little girl had been saved. The nurse's station was abandoned when she approached. Then she saw why. They were all in the break room pressed against the glass watching her walk by. All except one. Vanessa Cross stood at the station alone. When Reese approached, Vanessa's face crumpled. I'm sorry, Vanessa whispered, tears streaming. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. We treated you like... You treated me exactly how I let you treat me, Reese said, not unkindly. I was hiding. You just didn't see through it. But we should have. The way you moved, the way you worked. We should have known you were... Vanessa's voice broke. What a seal. Reese shook her head. Nobody expects that. That's the point of cover. For what it's worth, Vanessa wiped her eyes. You saved that bus driver, and the little girl with the bee sting, and the ambassador. You're a hero. I'm a medic. I do the job, that's all. She walked past, leaving Vanessa standing there. At the hallway T intersection, she met Dr. Chase Harrington. He looked terrible. His wrist was in a brace. His face was gaunt shadows under his eyes like bruises. He'd aged 10 years in 4 days. They stood facing each other. Long silence. I didn't know, Harrington finally whispered. You didn't want to know, Reese replied quietly. You saw someone who wouldn't fight back and assumed weakness. That says everything about you and nothing about me. The Department of Defense, the investigation, Harrington's voice was hollow. I'll probably lose my license. Maybe you'll learn something from this. What, that I'm a coward? No. Reese's voice softened slightly. That competence doesn't announce itself. That the people you dismiss might be the ones who save you. That hierarchy doesn't equal skill. I'm sorry, Harrington said, and this time he meant it. Reese looked at him for a long moment, saw something broken in his eyes, but also something that might eventually heal into wisdom. The bus driver you froze on, he's alive, made a full recovery. He asked about you. Harrington's eyes widened. He did. He wanted to thank the medical team who saved him. I told him you placed the chest tube that ultimately saved his life. It was a small lie, a kind one. You finished what I started, doctor. Don't forget that. It wasn't entirely true, but Harrington needed to hear it. Needed something to build on. Thank you, Harrington whispered. Reese nodded and walked past him. Room 304's door was open. Colonel Garrett Sullivan was in bed, oxygen mask on, visibly weaker than 4 days ago. But when he saw her in dress blues, his face transformed. Pure joy. He tried to salute, but his hands shook too badly. Reese crossed the room in 3 strides, took his hand gently, and helped him raise it. They held the salute together. When she released it, Sullivan gestured to the chair. Sit, kid. Let an old man look at you properly. Reese sat on the bed's edge, suddenly aware of how tired she was. Not physically, emotionally. Saw you on the news, Sullivan said each word in effort. Whole hospital can't talk about anything else. You're famous. I didn't want famous. I just wanted to do my job. Sometimes the job makes you famous, whether you want it or not. Sullivan coughed a wet, rattling sound. I'm dying, kid. Days, not weeks. Nothing you can do about that. Colonel, let me finish. His voice was firm despite the weakness. I waited 50 years to see what I saw. A real warrior, not the Hollywood kind, the real kind who fights when it matters and hides when it doesn't, who saves lives. I've taken lives too, sir. I know, that's what makes you dangerous. You know both sides. But you chose to save. That matters. Silence. The oxygen machine hissed. The heart monitor beeped. What now? Sullivan asked. Teaching. Training the next generation of combat medics at Coronado, so they're ready when their moment comes. Sullivan's hand found hers. Surprisingly strong grip. You made a choice, triage. That's the job. You can't save everyone, but you can train everyone to save someone. That's the legacy that matters. Tears formed in Reese's eyes. Thank you, Colonel, for seeing me. Thank you, kid, for reminding me why we serve. Not for glory, for each other. He took a labored breath. Teach them that. Teach them silence isn't weakness. It's strength waiting for the right moment. Teach them the real victory isn't the kills. It's the lives you save afterward. I will, sir. I promise. I know you will. His eyes were starting to close. Now get out of here. Go save the next generation. Reese stood, rendered one more perfect salute. Sullivan tried to return it, but his hand barely lifted. She held her salute until his hand fell back. Hoo-yah, Colonel, she whispered. Hoo-yah, Chief, he breathed back. She walked to the door, turned one last time. Sullivan was still watching her, smiling despite the oxygen mask, despite everything. She stepped into the hallway. 10 minutes later, the monitors in room 304 alarmed. Nurses came running. But Colonel Garrett Sullivan, United States Army Rangers, was already gone. Peaceful, his mission complete. 6 months later, Naval Special Warfare Center, Coronado, California. Reese stood in front of a classroom. 30 young combat medics sat at attention, watching her with awe and terror. The 3 rules, she said, writing on the whiteboard. 1, your skills under pressure determine if they go home. 2, silence can be strength, but action saves lives. 3, never leave a teammate behind. A student raised his hand. Chief Kincaid, is it true you operated on the Ambassador under fire for 15 minutes? The mission isn't about me, it's about getting everyone home. She projected a photo on the screen. Kyle Brennan in full kit grinning. This was Petty Officer First Class Kyle Brennan. I trained him. He was KIA in Mogadishu doing his job. Every one of you carries his legacy. You are here to make sure the next generation comes home. The room was silent. After class, there was a knock on her office door. Commander Vance entered, carrying a wooden frame. How's teaching life, Chief? It's still the fight, ma'am, just a different battlefield. Vance handed her the frame. Inside was Colonel Sullivan's obituary and a handwritten note. The note read, Chief Kincaid, you reminded this old ranger why we serve, not for medals, for each other. Teach them that. G.S. Reese stared at it, throat tight. He requested you receive this, Vance said quietly. I understand, ma'am. That weekend, Reese drove to Arlington National Cemetery. She found Sullivan's grave. The headstone was fresh, the grass not yet fully grown. She placed her combat medic badge on the granite and knelt. Rest easy, Ranger, she whispered. Mission complete. She stood and saluted, holding it as wind whispered through the endless rows of white stones. They had thought her silence was weakness. They were wrong. Silence was a warrior choosing when to speak. And when warriors speak, the world listens. Reese Kincaid walked through Arlington with her head high past the graves of those who'd made the same choice. To serve, to sacrifice, to save lives even when it cost everything. She was no longer invisible. She was exactly where she belonged, training the next generation, passing the torch, making sure that when the moment came there would be warriors ready, silent until the moment demanded otherwise, and then unstoppable. Chief Petty Officer Reese Kincaid served as lead instructor at Naval Special Warfare Medical Training Command for 8 years, personally training over 400 combat medics who deployed to every theater of operation across the globe. Her students called her the Reaper, with a mixture of fear and reverence, knowing that her standards were impossibly high because lives depended on it. Dr. Chase Harrington resigned from Metropolitan General Hospital under investigation. After 2 years of counseling and volunteer work with underserved communities, he now teaches medical ethics to young doctors with a particular focus on humility, recognizing competence regardless of rank and the critical importance of performing under pressure. He keeps a photo on his desk, the bus driver whose life was saved in Trauma Bay 1. A reminder, Colonel Garrett Sullivan, United States Army Rangers, was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. His final words whispered to Reese before she left his room that last time. Tell the next generation, silence isn't weakness. It's strength waiting for the right moment. Those words are now engraved on a memorial plaque at the SEAL training facility in Coronado. The bus driver whose life Reese saved during the mass casualty incident made a full recovery. He attended her graduation from the instructor course and presented her with a handmade wooden plaque that read, "To the chief who didn't hesitate when everyone else did." The little girl with the bee sting allergy, whose name was Emily, grew up healthy and strong. Years later, she would enlist in the Navy and request assignment as a hospital corpsman, citing the nurse who saved my life as her inspiration. She would eventually meet Chief Kincaid during her training. Neither of them mentioned that day in Trauma Bay 2. They didn't need to. And in a trauma bay at Metropolitan General Hospital, there now hangs a small plaque that reads, "Competence has no rank. Humility has no substitute. Never judge the warrior by the uniform they wear." Metropolitan General's employee handbook was revised to include a new section on respect, dignity, and recognizing excellence in all forms. The section was written by Vanessa Cross, who had taken over as Director of Nursing and made it her mission to ensure no one would ever be treated the way Reese had been. The Black Hawk pilots who flew that mission received commendations for exceptional airmanship under combat conditions. They framed a photo of the landing at Metropolitan General and hung it in the squadron ready room with the caption, "The day we picked up Reaper." And sometimes late at night when Reese stood in front of her classes, teaching the next generation of combat medics, she would pause and look at Kyle Brennan's photo on her office wall, at Sullivan's memorial plaque, at the letters from the students she'd trained who'd gone on to save lives in places that didn't exist on maps. And she would think, this is the mission that matters. Not the kills, the lives saved afterward, the legacy that lives on. Silent until the moment demands otherwise, and then unstoppable.